So today we had another day of testimony in the DePuy ASR case, the Kransky case, and there was some groundbreaking testimony in the case today. Today was another day where the defendants put on their case, and they brought in a biomechanics expert. And this mechanics expert on cross-examination was forced to admit that he made a crucial error in something that he presented to the jury. Specifically, this expert was brought in to basically testify that the hip was not defective and that it was tested adequately. And one of the opinions he gave that was very interesting was that he was of the opinion that the hip was put in at the wrong angle, and that was the cause of all the problems. And when I say the angle, what I'm talking about is here's a cup. This is a DePuy ASR cup. And when it goes into your hip socket, it can be at different angles, like this, okay? And the studies have shown that if you go at the steeper angle, okay, you end up with more wear and tear because the ball of the hip rides on the edge of the cup. The flatter the angle, the less wear and tear. And so what this expert did was he took an x-ray of Mr. Kransky's hip, and he measured the angle. So he had a line down here, and he drew a line like this that measured the angle of the cup. And what he determined in this presentation that he submitted to the jury was that the angle was at 63 degrees, between 63 and 65 degrees, which is pretty steep for a hip like this. Even though there's a range, everybody understand there's a range of angles, this expert determined that that was too steep of an angle, and that's what caused the wear and tear on the hip. On cross-examination, and the cross-examination in this case was probably the best in the whole trial, was done by Mike Kelly, one of the lead plaintiff's attorneys. And one of the things he did was he took that x-ray, the x-ray that the expert had shown to the jury, and basically just took a protractor, the kind of protractor you would get at Walgreens, and the kind of protractor that most people learned to use, I think, in 3rd or 4th grade. And he took it and he put it up on the x-ray, and what he discovered and what he got the expert to admit was that the angle actually wasn't 63 to 65 degrees, it was about 57 degrees, 56 degrees, which is a lot different than what he testified to on direct. On redirect, this is when the defendants get to ask questions at the very end after the plaintiffs ask questions. He really didn't have any explanation at all as to why he had mismeasured this very simple measurement in the case. So that was very, very good testimony, I think, for the plaintiffs. Really undermined the expert's credibility. And the cross-examination was very good. I mean, there was many times where Mike Kelly was asking the expert, how do you explain the fact that this hip has had 8,000 premature revision surgeries if it's not defective? And there was really no answer to that. And he would ask them, how do you explain that DePuy's own internal documents determined that this hip was defective, and actually used the word defective? And there was no explanation for that. So I think the expert and the testimony he gave was substantially undermined by what the plaintiffs did in the case. Now, the other expert we had was an infectious disease expert. And this was very interesting testimony. And basically, it provided an alternative theory. So you have one expert saying, well, the problems with their hip was because the doctor put it in at too steep an angle, and that caused excessive wear and tear. And then the second expert comes in and says, wear and tear had nothing to do with this. The plaintiff actually had an infection. And this was an infection he had acquired 2 years before the hip had been taken out. And it was an infection that he contracted when he was receiving chemotherapy through a port, and that this infection traveled through his body and ended up in his hip. What was interesting about the testimony was that there really was no explanation for the fact that none of the surgeons and doctors who were treating Mr. Kransky at the time, who did the revision surgery, noted that there was an infection. And And if you look at this whole aspect of the case is slightly confusing, and it was difficult. But I think on cross-examination, the facts were sort of laid out for the jury, and the facts are that an infection is very difficult to diagnose. When somebody has an infection, you usually do what's called a culture, which is a way to determine whether bacteria is present. The problem is cultures often take 2 weeks. 1 to 2 weeks to grow, so you know definitively whether somebody has an infection or not. In this case, the surgeon went into Mr. Kransky's hip and saw what looked like an infection, and it was shown on cross-examination that a reaction to metal particles, which we call metallosis, and an infection look very, very similar to the surgeons. And the only way to really know whether it's an infection or metallosis is by cultures. But when you're operating, you won't get those results for 1 to 2 weeks as you're operating. So most of the time, the doctors will treat it as if it is an infection, just in case it is. And that's what happened in this case. So this expert tried to take that and really exploit sort of the contradictory testimony from some of the treating doctors about infection and metallosis to create a lot of confusion. But I think at the end of the day, the jurors will see that in this case there was a situation where the doctor thought it might be an infection, but it turned out not to be. It was metallosis. And we know that because the cultures came back negative. And we also know that because of the tissue damage and the appearance of the tissue in the hip. There was black staining of the tissue in the hip joint, which is indicative of metallosis. So otherwise, I think it was a very good day for the plaintiffs today. They did a very good job of countering what the defense put on. But it's up for the jury to decide. If you have a metal-on-metal hip or any type of hip that's causing you problems, feel free to give us a call. My name's Stuart Talley. My number is 916-448-9800. You can also reach me by Skype. We do video conferencing here. My Skype address is Stuart Talley, which should be easy to find. And if you want some more information about cobalt and chromium toxicity, we have a website that has lots of medical journal articles with the most up-to-date research. We have videotaped interviews with toxicologists and other experts in cobalt and chromium, hours of videotape that you can review. And that website's www.cobalt-chromium-toxicity.com.